Let me quickly introduce myself. I'm Rowan North. I'm a freelance illustrator and art educator. You can find my stuff at rowannorthillustrations.org, which I posted in my last panel, but I can repost. So we can go around and quickly introduce everyone. Let's start with Dan. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Try to keep it brief.
Sure. My name is Dan Haring. My primary function in life is working in animation and video games, but I also write and draw.
Fabulous. And then Michael.
All right, Dan, when she's like, keep it brief, you're all done. My name's Michaelbrent Collings. I've written 40-something books, international bestseller, multiple Bram Stoker Award winner, blah, blah, blah. I do my own covers, but as far as like actual art go, I'm going to be the enthusiastic guy, not the knowledgeable one. It'll get to me and I'll be like, that's awesome.
Yeah, and then we'll have Mike quickly introduce themselves when they get here. Michael, you'll do great. So to start off with, I guess the most important question is, why do you like horror? What drew you to it? Dan, do you want to start?
Sure. So I wouldn't say I'm a huge horror aficionado. I do like certain things, but it's not like I go out and watch every horror movie that comes out. That's just but what draws me to it is just there's a little bit of adrenaline with it. You get that sense of fear and foreboding and dread that comes with horror. And it's exciting to read stuff that you're not having to live through. I like that aspect of it. But it's interesting to delve into, the darker aspects of life and see what lives there.
Is that Mike? Do we have our last missing person?
You should have it. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. We don't have your video, but that should be fine.
Hold on.
Unless you're sitting very still. Oh, there we go.
There we go. Excellent. Do you want to introduce yourself really fast?
Sure. I'm Mike Lovins. I'm a commercial illustrator. Have been since 1993. Worked for advertising, concept design, that kind of a thing. This is my current book called We Go Anywhere, about a company that does business in outer space. And I've also worked on client for Edgar Allan Poe projects, so I have a little experience in the darkness there. So,
Spoopy, thank you so much. We asked the question, like, why do you like horror? Why are you drawn to it? So we're going to go back to Michaelbrent Collings. If you want to, do you want to skip?
No, that's fine. Sorry, I was like, okay, look, all of us are artists, and I'm going to assume everybody watching is an artist of some kind. So if any of us fuzz out randomly, like someone else came onto my screen and I was like, what are we doing with this magic? I love horror. I love horror. My dad was the world expert on Stephen King. He wrote a dozen books on him. And so I tell everyone I grew up with screaming or typing in the next room. And so I grew up and I ended up writing as I found out I was useless for anything else. And I made a career out of it. I started, I'm an indie, and I started out making my own covers, which was a huge mistake. Most people definitely shouldn't do that. And I'm not super artistic, but I did find out what doesn't work and what does work. And I love the shadows, even artistically, just the detail and the interest that those things can bring out.
One quick, Mike Lovins, why are you drawn to horror? What drew you to it?
Well, most of my work has been outside of it. However, I did work on an Edgar Allan Poe project called the Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. And I guess what really draws me to it, at least the way that he narrates, is it's a psychology, right? The psychology is what drives horror. And the characters dealing with their own psychosis is just common theme in Poe. The creepiness of the narration visually. The psychology really is what drives it. I guess that draws me to it is it's really a fascinating way to tell a story. That kind of aspect of what is driving our fears, our paranoia. And that was another common theme with Poe. And so it was really a fascinating experience to work on that project.
So it's more of a you like the more psychological horror or the mental disorder kind of angle. Am I getting that right?
Hitchcock thrived on it. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
He used a different type of narration on it visually as well. We're talking about the shadows, but really the psychology is what drove his stories, and that's what created the horror. The things that we didn't want to face about ourselves, and that's basically what draws me to it, I think.
That's really cool. Thank you so much. All right. So, why did you decide to start drawing creepy things or writing creepy things? What gave you the decision, if it was a specific project and stuff? I know, Mike, you kind of already covered that with the Edgar Allan Poe project. But for the rest of you, what made you start drawing horror? What project was it that you had to kind of delve in? Dan, go ahead.
That's a good question, and my mom would love to know the answer to that. Because
Dude.
I grew up reading comics and liking, darker things, and I'd be sitting in the living room drawing, and one time she's like, "Why can't you draw pretty things?" And it just wasn't appealing to me. And then later on, my wife kind of coined my artwork as dripping flesh. So I mean, it's a great question. I don't know what it is. I just have always been drawn to kind of darker, creepier looking things. My favorite superhero is Batman. And if you think about it, he's not a mentally sound person, and he thrives in the darkness. So I'm not sure, but something about that darkness, that unknown, just has always appealed to me. And not like explicit gore necessarily, but just the darkness, and like Mike mentioned, the psychology behind things, and the dark spaces in our minds.
Awesome. What was your first project, Dan, for you specifically? What was your first project that you kind of had to do or start doing horror stuff?
A lot of I worked in cartoons for a long time, and most of those weren't. I mean, Hotel Transylvania is probably the darkest it ever got as far as movies that I worked on.
Scared me.
As far as personal. So I co-wrote a book with Marcy Kit Connolly, and it does have some dark creatures in that, and so that was my first, I guess, professional work where I was diving into darker elements. So I guess it'd be that.
Beautiful. Since we're live now, if anyone has questions, please post it in the chat. I'm going to try to leave time for Q&A at the end. So please go forth, ask those questions. So now, Michael, when did you start drawing or writing horror? What project were you working on? Like what started the horror stuff for you?
Oh my gosh. Well, I excuse me. I still have morning mouth, and I'm an author, so I barely got up. We all work weird hours, let's be honest. So I was telling people for the archive, my dad was he was an expert on Stephen King, so I just grew up around it. I remember writing it. I killed a bully. I was the sort of stereotypical nerdy dork guy who couldn't protect himself. And there was this guy who just malevolently, maliciously, and continuously physically and verbally abused me. And I couldn't do anything about it, but I could do something in a story. And it did. It made me feel better. And it's part of it is that draws us to horror, I think, is there's this fear that we have, all of us, of the unknown, which is just a fancy, classy way of saying my own powerlessness. And horror allows us to examine it. And as soon as we examine it, we can understand it. And that allows us to control it. So horror gives us this measure of control of our universe. And it also allows us, more than any genre, to look at the big questions. I mean, big questions. In fantasy, an angel's not going to come to us. In sci-fi, you're not going to draw God on the cover of the comic. But in horror, there's a priest who saves the little girl. And so you have to talk about the stuff that's beyond and the stuff that's bigger. And I love that, just that ability to examine it.
Well, he hit the nail right on the head, because horror is about powerlessness, right? If you ever look at Halloween and some of these other films, it's always from the point of view of the assailant, and then you've got the victims running and recoiling in horror. So it's always about that feeling of powerlessness, and that's what creates horror in our lives. Is when we don't have control over what's happening.
Yeah.
Thank you so
And are
much.
aware that we might have something good, because horror exists only in the shadow of hope,
I really like that. Unless it's a grim, dark world, and that's a panel for another day. Oof. Warhammer, anyone? Mike, was there any other projects that you worked on before you did the Edgar Allan Poe one, or is that like your main like horror delving into?
As far as horror goes, yeah. I mean, most of it has been in concept design, storyboards, and then
Right.
about a company that does business in outer space. But I'm the student of narrative and the shadows and all that, and so yeah.
A student of the shadows. I love
That's
that.
awesome.
It's on his business card.
If you ever noticed, I mean, one of the great artists in comics that is great in shadow and creating that kind of a ambiance is Alex Toth. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. He was a master at creating that kind of environment. And the Tomb of Dracula, Gene Colan, Marv Wolfman, he was a master at creating those kind of shadows and narrative that suck people into that kind of world,
Definitely.
Thank you. My next question is like, what are your actually kind of plays right into that, Mike? Is what are your horror inspirations? What artists like inspire you? What writings inspire you? What movies? Things like that. What are your horror inspirations? Dan.
So I don't know how horror it's considered, but The Crow came out. The movie came out when I was in high school, and that was a big kind of like a big wake up call to me. Like, whoa, there's this, because I grew up reading just superhero comics mainly, and so I didn't really understand the whole fact that comics isn't a genre, but it's a collection of genres, just like any other medium. And so that opened my eyes to things. And The Crow definitely has some horror elements. I wouldn't say that's pure horror, but that was one of the things that was kind of a key. I'm missing the word, but it was kind of a lightning bolt that like struck me like, oh, there's some dark stories out there. In middle school, there was a girl that I had a crush on who was reading Stephen King books. I was like, hey, I'll try this out. And so I read a few and kind of got pretty scared. So I'd say probably those two were the two things that kind of kicked me off and inspired a little bit more of the darker aspects of my media consumption.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael.
First of all, like, I love what most of you guys do. Like, I could just attend the panel just on art. Seriously, because so much of horror, especially, I mean, it's driven by visual and the lack of visuals, like working with nothing. So many horror comics, horror graphic novels, horror movies, they exist in darkness. There's just the flashes that you see. And also, or they exist in sparseness. I'm thinking of, what was the one with the comic that was Jack the Ripper? And it was made into From Hell.
From Hell.
Yeah, so like really sparse. And so either way, you don't have detail to work with. And I love how horror visual people can work with the lack of detail to create that fear and that interest that drags you forward. And I'm fascinated by the fact that most people who think of horror who don't know it, they're not thinking of a book. They're thinking subconsciously of the latest Saw movie poster. Like it's this visual flash that drives them to their knowledge of horror. And then you explain how much broader it is. but so much of this genre really is images in our head, and I love looking at stuff like these guys do. It just blows me away. It's so cool.
Thank you so much. Quickly, I'm going to go in and say some of my horror inspirations because I also draw horror and stuff. I want to especially point out Junji Ito, who's become very, very popular over the past while. Very body horror. If you guys don't like holes in skin and body, like spiders coming out of cats' mouths, don't look at Junji Ito. But he is a anime artist that is famous for his body horror type concepts. So if you're really wanting like disturbing imagery, I go ahead and Google him.
I totally forgot to mention, as Mike, I should have mentioned it, but Poe was a big influence on me too. I remember sitting in my parents' bed and reading The Pit and the Pendulum and just kind of being blown away. So sorry to dive back in, but I can't forget Poe, especially since Mike mentioned him.
Well, it's an intense experience when you read his stuff, you know.
It really is. Actually, speaking of Poe, one thing I wanted to bring up, based on what Michael said, is also suspense. Like Michael said, you've got the quick flashes of imagery, but it's also the lack thereof, like someone else mentioned. The suspense, the build-up, not having things in your face. If you have so many jump scares, you come immune to it. I think about those people who stream Five Nights at Freddy's, right? All those jump scares, they eventually become immune to it. But if you have a slow build-up before jump scares or before anything, there is one game I can think in particular that did this masterfully, and that was Thief 2014, the Asylum level. It was beautifully done with suspense, and there are things you miss your first time around that, or their second or your third, just because it's so subtle, and I love that. All right, going on to the next question. Wait, Mike, do you have anything to add to that? Your inspirations, or is it just Edgar Allan Poe and the artists you brought up?
Kubrick would be another one for the same reason I mentioned before, like The Shining. He gets into the psychology, the way the camera moves, the way the shots are composed, the way he gets into people's head during that movie. That's what makes the horror of it work, right? Is you're getting into the psychosis of him devolving into something. It frightens his members of his own family, the assailant Jack Nicholson. But if they didn't address it from a psychological standpoint, the film wouldn't have worked. That's, to me, is what really makes effective horror.
Thank you so much. All right. So what are some ways that you, like, kind of going off of what we talked about with our inspirations, what are some ways that you make a piece or a book feel creepy? How do you add that creepiness into your work? Let's start actually backwards. Let's start with Mike.
While working on the Poe project, you just have to get into the bottom of the barrel, so to speak, when it comes to horror. I had to get psychologically into the creepy aspect. You had dismembered people getting heads getting chopped off and stuff like that, people getting delirious with fever, running into natives that wanted to murder them, and you really just had to get into the creepy aspect of it. And once I got into that frame of mind, the images followed. But you really just have to get into that frame of mind that this is a place you don't want to be in, and you have to portray that and to convey that to your viewer.
I love that the whole, you got to put your brain in that place in order to start being able to draw it right. That Michael, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think excuse me, in horror, even in the dark stuff, you have to remember that really horror is about wanting something. It's not horror if there's nothing to lose. And the difference between horror and a thriller is a thriller, like, that the guy or the gal has a good life and there's the threat of it being taken. And in horror, you start out with the taking. The monster kills someone close to you or it threatens right there on the horizon. But even in the grimmest, darkest stuff, these people are still trying to move forward to some kind of goal. And that's true in graphic novels. It's just, I love that you mentioned video games. Like Silent Hill 2 was one of the most epic, coolest, scariest video games. And it's about what? It's about looking for your loved one and willing to traverse hell. And the goal could be very simple. It could be finding the killer or surviving. But there's always this hope. Or Dark City, it's just unraveling the mystery and figuring out how it applies to my life. And so we're our first viewer, we're our first audience. And I love that Mike said that you dig into that psychology, not just vaguely, but because like this scares me, this disconcerts me. How can I broaden it so that it does the same to everyone?
Thank you. Dan, what about you? What are some ways that make your pieces feel creepy?
I like that you mentioned Dark City. I haven't seen that for a long time, but it's such a great movie.
Right.
So it's like the name of this panel. It's all about shadows. Because we fear what we don't know, right? I think about the first season of Stranger Things. The Demogorgon was really scary because you only saw it in shadow and these flashes. Once it jumped out, spoiler alerts, and you see, okay, it's a creature. You can kind of put a face to it. It loses some of that. And so keeping things in the shadow for as long as possible, drawing it out, because if you jump into things and like, you know, the great thing about prose is you can take them like second by second, moment by moment into and just build up the dread and the fear and the worry. So I think that's an effective way, and just keeping things unknown for as long as possible, because like the other gentleman mentioned, these guys mentioned before, that's what we're scared of, is we're scared of what we don't understand and we don't have power over. So trying to expand that and extend that as long as possible, I think, can really be helpful.
I love that. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, a great example of that is Ridley Scott's Alien. Most of the film is shrouded in darkness. Everything from the lighting of the ship that they're in to the characters and the assailant, the alien, of course, you almost see nothing of them. And when you do, there's strobe lights. He's going in and out of frame, and you really don't even get to see this creature until the end of the film. It's Ridley Scott was smart enough to notice what you don't show. It's what you're not showing that's scaring people. The way that he narrated that, the frames of the shots, really, you watch it and you're like, man, this is a pretty frightening experience. And you get sucked into it because of the way they're narrating it.
Along that
Tell you
line,
something really quick about that movie.
go ahead.
Everyone says that, like, oh, he was smart enough to do that. It was a mistake. He intended to show the alien right at the beginning, but it looked so stupid, they had to draw it back, you know, because they didn't have CGI, and it was essentially a skinny guy in a... Yeah, it was stupid looking. And same with Predator. They had an alien and they realized it looked like a giant green lobster. It was terrible. And so they had to draw it back. And it turned out so well and became such a masterclass in that fear. And it's notable that the only explicit moments happen to red shirts, not the main character. Like, you see the blood explode from John Hurt in Alien, but he is never the thing that you're fearing. He's the example of what could be Ripley. And I love that. But I think that's so funny that, you know, so many of the things that we do as artists are accidents. You know, we write something or we draw something, we're like, I'll put on a filter on a book cover and I'm like, oh, I did not mean to click that, but that will stay.
You know, it's true.
Yeah.
Same thing happened in Jaws. They could not get that shark
Yeah.
to work. It didn't look real. So as a result, they hit it, but that's what made it work.
Yeah.
Thing.
Yep.
That's actually really
Working
funny.
within the limitations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's really funny because that's actually one of our questions. I don't want to steal our volunteers' thunder, but they hated it when or his wife hated it when in the movie Signs they show the aliens. Says showing the aliens ruined the movie. How do you have a scary creature hidden in the darkness without ruining it by showing it?
This is
great
the hardest
question.
question.
Well, because I mean, like Signs was so suspenseful and so scary, and then like I mentioned with Stranger Things, once you can view something in full brightness and in daytime, it's like, okay, this is maybe something that's I can understand it, and maybe I can fight back against it. You can't fight back against the unknown or the darkness. Like it's just too vague. So that's a great question, and I don't know. I'll pass it to the other guys because I don't have a good answer for how to solve it.
Mike?
I just think it's what you don't show that makes it work. And, I said Ridley Scott, Kubrick understood that, and Hitchcock understood that very, very well. A lot of these horror guys devolve into doing a lot of graphic, explicit stuff, but Hitchcock scared people because of what he didn't show. That's what made it work. But of course, that's just my 2 cents on it,
That's really great. That actually goes into my questions about monsters. How do you really make a scary monster? Since we're kind of on that topic, it's like how do you make a monster scary? You guys have kind of answered this already, but what are some other design features you can do to really enhance the ooky factor on your creatures, as opposed to it being like something the internet, rule 64s or something?
I think there's kind of 2 ways you can approach it. One is to make it so like just messed up and beyond what you're used to seeing that it kind of breaks your mind a little bit. I can't think of a really good example of that, but the other way is to make it close to what you're used to seeing, but just something's off. There's a character in Sandman, the comic, and he looks like a normal guy wearing sunglasses. And then he takes his sunglasses off and his eyes are mouths. And it's just so off-putting because it's so close to being normal, but it has that one thing that like kind of spikes you in the brain. It's like, whoa, that's so weird and strange to me that it scares me.
It's the Uncanny Valley effect.
Yeah, Uncanny Valley.
Called, yeah.
That's actually a thing I have a question about, but I think that actually goes into more the body horror as well. Body horror element where things are so weird and twisted that it ooks us out. Do you want to?
Yeah, I remember a trailer from a while ago. I don't know the movie, but there's like an old lady grandma who's like crawling down the stairs on her on her hands and knees, and her head is like twisted around, like stuff like that, where it's like, it's a normal person just doing something really wrong.
Yeah. Michael, do you want to actually expand on Uncanny Valley and what precisely that means?
Oh, well, that's a psychological term. So that's one of the fun things about horror is we get to play with like science, and not in a fantastic way, but like we can look at psychology that we know and attenuate it and screw with it basically, which makes us feel superior as artists, and that's important. And the Uncanny Valley effect is like if you see somebody who's hideously burned, you accommodate to that. You go, they're hideously burned, and that's no big deal. If you saw somebody with eyes that were here, that's a birth defect, and for some reason, it's so much worse than this horrible scarring. I remember I went to the store. Well, I had a quadriplegic friend, and we became friends. I sat down next to him at a function, and I was like, "So you can't move from here down. What's the story with that?" And he loved that. He was like, "That is so cool that you let's talk about it and get it out of the way." And then I went to the store pre-COVID. Some guy was wearing a face mask, and it was clear from the shape of his face that he was missing part of his nose and jaw. And for a person who's not disturbed by stuff, that really was weird. It was just off. And it wouldn't have been if I'd seen it all. It was just a slight difference in his shape from what was the normal. And it was disconcerting and it was off-putting. And we talked actually in the store. He was super nice. And it still stayed with me. And part of the Uncanny Valley effect, I think, is the question it sets up, like, what the crap happened to them? And is this something that's going to affect me?
Thank you so much. That's a really great thing, just like that off. Or even in like animated movies, I would like to add, Uncanny Valley typically refers to things that are too real Like they tried so hard to animate something so real and like forego the stylization that it just feels off in our brains.
Like
'Cause
Final Fantasy.
Well, and
which
Yeah.
one?
I was totally thinking of that.
Final Fantasy was like kind of the main when it came out. It's like, oh, this is going to be photoreal. It's going to look like humans, and you look at it, you're like, that's weird. That's not normal. But yeah, it's they're trying to get so close. But we have been trained since birth. We have been looking at people our whole lives. We know how facial tics work. We know how emotions work, and it's really hard for an animator to nail all those things. If you stylize it, kind of like with the quadriplegic, your brain accepts it. You're like, okay, I can accept this because it's stylized. It's not meant to be. But if it's trying to be perfectly human and it doesn't work, our brain notices it.
oh, yeah,
The insides of mouths of every character on every video game. It's like their teeth are perfect. I can see each individual beard hair. And then there's this Cthulhu thing in the back of their throat. And I can't figure out what it is. You don't see it. You're just like, something's messed up in the sergeant's mouth. Like he should fix that before killing the Nazis.
someone who's really good at this kind of thing is Michael's talking about all the weird, things that we just can't deal with that don't seem right. Bernie Wrightson was a master at this kind of thing. He had characters. There's a graphic novel of Spider-Man called Hooky, and they go into these creatures, and then you have these weird, abnormal creatures with arms coming out of arms and mouths coming out of mouths and that kind of a thing. And he was a master at that. And you just freak out because it's just not what we're acclimatized to seeing when we grow up and when we look at faces, and it freaks us out. And that's another element of horror.
Thank you so much. I think that actually there is a question that I'm going to steal from the audience. Is why is slightly off way worse than way off? Anyone
I think
can.
part of it is way off. You can analyze it. If it's a giant bug monster with tentacles, you're like, bug monster, giant tentacles, those are not okay, but let's talk about killing it. The Uncanny Valley stuff tends to be mysterious, first of all, so you have no idea how to deal with it. You're like, okay, the eyes are off. And I'm talking about animation. I'm not talking about actual people for the most part. Like you go up and talk to those people and you interact with them because their souls are more important. But in a visual medium, you're sitting there going, what happened? Oh, the Sandman, the mouth eyes. Oh, I loved that. And it was so creepy. And every time it comes on, I'm going, what is that? Like, is that going to happen to Morpheus, right? I can't ever remember the names of people.
Yeah.
Is that going to happen to the people I care about? And by extension, me. That is so mysterious, and it's so close to reality. Like, I'm not going to turn into a bug monster, but could my face melt a little bit? Possibly.
Right. And also, I think it's like, okay, that thing is wrong with them. What else could be potentially wrong with them too? Like, that's just kind of like a on the surface thing of, okay, that person's not right. I'm kind of scared about what else could be going on.
Along those lines, it didn't mean to be, but the Elephant Man is sort of uncomfortable for all those reasons, because the way they play with the shadows, you can see enough of him, and he's human, but in many ways we just can't what he's got disfigured that you mentioned with that other person you ran into makes us uncomfortable about ourselves. Could this happen to me? What if I got some kind of a life-altering disease that disfigured me? I mean, those are the kind of things that horror writers and artists play off of. Elephant Man didn't mean to be that. It sort of came off that way,
That's fascinating. So speaking of like slightly creepy and Uncanny Valley, do you guys want to see something that's slightly uncanny and creeps people out?
Of course.
Hyperextending arm.
Oh my gosh, not okay.
And that's exactly it. It's weird because like my body does that naturally, but because it's weird and something you don't see, it freaks people out. I feel like this is a great visual example of what we're talking about here. Sorry.
Do you ever do that and walk around the store and just like look at people and smile? Or
no, it's more of like a party trick. I can actually twist my arm all the way around because it is hyperextending like that.
Let's not do that.
Okay.
Yeah,
And, part of that is like I've had that happen. But I am not double jointed, so, and that's part of it too. You see somebody that's double jointed and you immediately go, oh my gosh, I have separated and dislocated my shoulders. It's not cool. Stop doing that, woman.
I think that plays into our own like horrors, the
Yeah.
things that we are scared of, which I know Lovecraft played into a lot. With like the Cthulhu thing is because he's freaking scared of the ocean, and there's actually a lot of like racism in his books because, let's face it, he was scared of these other races and other people.
It
Things he
is a
doesn't
big spider
understand.
at the end because Stephen King is scared of spiders.
Fabulous. All right, you guys ready for another question? This is more for artists, the artist side of things. How is lighting important in a horror piece?
It kind of just goes back to what we've talked about a little bit, where if you see something in broad daylight, it's not going to be as scary as if you see it in flashes or in partial darkness, or in, we see half of its face or whatever. So lighting is huge in comics and in movies and TV. It's what you don't see that scares you. And so I grew up in a very small town with like zero light pollution, and sometimes at night we'd have to go outside and feed the animals. And you're walking around and you can hear the horses move around or whatever, and my imagination would just go crazy. If I'd had a flashlight, it would have been fine because it's a horse, it's a goat or whatever, So it's all about the unknown and being able to see it or not see it.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, when you go to a restaurant, what really makes a restaurant work is ambiance, and that's all part of lighting. And I refer back again to Bernie Wrightson. His Frankenstein is a masterpiece. It's a perfect example of what we're talking about. The way he lights up that laboratory, the way that he chooses to cast the light on the creatures just makes it really, really work in terms of a horror piece. The other thing you're doing with lighting and why it's so critical is you're narrating and leading the eye to where you want it to go. The way you place your blacks, and Alex Toth is really good at this, so is Jim Steranko. You lead the eye to where you want it to go, to the next sequence, to take the reader along that journey, whether it's horror, whether it's anything else. But leading the eye is really critical in lighting too. So
I'm curious what Michaelbrent has had experience with as far as covers, like, and your cover design. I'd love to hear about that.
Yes, please.
It's very similar. I mean, like, you look behind me and here's some of my covers, and there's a lot of dark shadows on them and areas that pop. I mean, your eye is drawn to the brightness, like, let's see if I can do this, like this one. You see this little thing of blue, but it wouldn't matter if it wasn't surrounded by all this darkness. And so when we're talking about horror art, and again, like, I will say, I am the enthusiastic guy. What I've learned is mostly because I know, I sucked when I did that, so I'm not going to do that again, rather than here's what I've designed that works. But so much of it is contrast, and so much of horror is contrast. I mean, when you have a monster, one of the best ways to show it's scary is to have it easily destroy a character who is stronger than our protagonist. Alien 3, which was kind of a train wreck, but it's killing off rapists and serial killers and murderers left and right. And of course, one of the big problems was Ripley in that one, she's stronger than anyone. And so there's less of the threat than there is in the first one, where she is arguably, and definitely the second one, she's the weakest physically on the ship. And so when it tears people apart from the inside, who are stronger, bigger, in the 80s, more masculine, and by virtue of their masculinity stronger, it's like, what chance does this little girl have to survive? And then what chance does Newt have to survive in Aliens? And so art works very similarly. It's highlighting the brightness, but showing us it's surrounded by darkness. and the darkness threatens to engulf it at any moment.
Thank you so much. If you don't mind, there's actually a couple pieces I can show that I have here that kind of show with the lighting what we're talking about. If that's okay with you guys.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, so here's we have about 5 minutes left if you guys have any other final questions. So that one, we have the flashlight light illuminating like the broken trees. So something massive, has destroyed that. But there's all this dark cypress forest here around it. Another example in the same series is this, where the character's illuminated, but there's something behind it that you can barely see. It's shiny teeth and things like that. So those are some examples of using lighting to help illuminate your point. And granted, my lighting's not great. If you want to see these pieces, I would check my website. But
Can I ask really quick, Dan, did you draw the Batman that's behind you?
No, this one over here, that was Jim Lee. Okay, I wish I was that good.
So. And Jim's no, I love Jim Lee. And so I was either going to say you draw like Jim Lee because he's one of my favorite Batman artists. So it would have been a super compliment. But he works so much in that, like everything that's important in that is surrounded by shadow, like the set of Batman's face. It's all darkness, his cape and the folds in it that lend the verisimilitude. His sternum overhangs and shadows his abdominal muscles. And you're like, that is a giant thing. This guy is so huge physically, and which is kind of sad in a way because we've drawn away from the detective aspect of it. Right. But I love all the way that shadow play works. And if it was a flat drawing without the high contrast, it wouldn't be as effective.
One thing I wanted to jump in on that really made Jim Lee's pieces work. Colorist I know, his name's Alex Sinclair, and he colored a lot of the Jim Lee Batman stuff. And the way he plays with the color and the lighting just accentuates it and makes it really work that way.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
It's just from a panel in Hush that they blew up.
Oh, I love that one. That one's so good.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. The thing I wanted to bring up along these lines is actually there's a fine art term for this, is chiaroscuro.
Right.
That this has been something that artists throughout time and history, especially through the Renaissance era, used to make their pieces more dramatic, and it's just reusing that idea, but for more of a horrific aspect. Think Hellboy and things like that as well. So we are about out of time. I think we already answered the questions everyone had. But do you guys have any other things that you want to mention about drawing horror or writing horror, things that are things that I didn't cover that you find interesting or you want people to look at?
That's a universe.
Sorry.
One thing that I was like, because I was kind of prepping for this last night, and I was thinking, well, what movies do this really well? And there's an old Audrey Hepburn movie called Wait Until Dark.
Oh,
it's amazing. It's not Hitchcock, but it's very Hitchcockian, and definitely check that one out if you get a chance.
Yeah, that's good. For all the reasons I mentioned,
Yeah. Mike, do you have anything to add as well? Like anything you want people to know about horror?
It's all about becoming a good narrator. And when you narrate effectively, you're going to get into whatever makes that work. And in horror, it's all the things we talked about, but you don't show, creating a feeling of powerlessness, having some hope at the end so the characters can escape whatever they're dealing with. All the things that we deal with, despair, getting sucked into an abyss. The more we know about life and being able to visually and from an author's standpoint tell a story, the more effective we're going to be, whether it's horror or any other kind of genre for that matter.
Thank you. Michaelbrent.
Horror is awesome. And horror is so much more nuanced and so much deeper and more subtle than most people who are naysayers realize. They're like, it's boobs. And you go, so but you went and saw this romance movie, which was pretty heavy into it. Oh, it's blood, but you have Saving Private Ryan on your shelf. Horror is something that infects so many different genres, and watching a masterclass in its focus, either visually or orally or mentally as you're reading it, it is so much fun. I did want to mention really quick. I have like a really expensive writing class that is I only put on sale for LTUE. It's 90% off, and it's through Sunday. So grab that if you want.
Thank you. Yes, please plug yourselves. Where can we find you next? Where can we find your work? What other panels are going to be on? Let's start with Dan, please.
So the book I co-wrote is called The Star Shepherd. It's middle grade fantasy with some dark elements. That's any bookstore or Amazon or wherever you can find that. I'm working on a video game. My company's working on a video game based on a horror franchise, but we can't talk about it yet because it's all secret-y stuff. But in a few years, hopefully that'll come out. And yeah, I'm on Twitter at Dan Haring. And if anybody has any questions, I'd love to meet up with you there.
All right. Thank you. Michaelbrent.
Mike didn't get the pimp.
Oh, well, I was going to go around this way.
Yeah, that's fine. Michael, go first.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay.
We're good.
All right. You good? All right. Mike, please.
Just take a look at my comic book called We Go Anywhere. You can also see it on Webtoons. Look up We Go Anywhere, and that's where all the episodes are right now.
I love Webtoons, so I will check that out.
Hey.
All right, and then for me, my next panel will be at 1. I will be moderating a panel about streaming, and that will be in O Butler. But I am Rowan North. You can find my stuff at rowannorthillustrations.org. I sell handmade paints and other things that I do, and all my projects you can find there too. So, yes.
Also, Mike and I will be on a comics and manga panel at 1, I believe.
I might
12 actually.
Oh, at 12.
Doing
12.
a presentation in 5 minutes, so I have to go.
Yes, please. Thank you so much, you guys.
Rowan, thank you, moderator.
Thank you, Rowan.
Thank you guys for so much, and have a great conference.